Hi, and welcome back to 10 Minute Strategy. My name is Peter Propp. I'm the Marketing Leadership Principal at Shore Communications. And we are here today with Bob Dorf. Bob has done many, many things in his career. Too many to talk about right now, but he is several things right now. He is a partner at K&S Ranch and a consultant there. And he's an adjunct professor in entrepreneurship at the Columbia Business School. But right now we're here to talk about Bob's new book, which is called The Startup Owner's Manual. Bob, why don't you tell us just a few minutes about your book?
Sure, be glad to. Thanks, Peter. Well, first, it's Steve Blank's in my book, and Steve is well known as sort of the developer of the customer development methodology, which he first sort of revealed about 12 years ago when he published the 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And the new book, the Startup Owner's Manual, is a much more granular, detailed, step-by-step guide to taking a startup idea, basically from the cocktail napkin to the sort of Series A or the A1 round. And it teaches people how to really follow a process that gets them out of the building, talking to customers, because most startups fail not for lack of technology or lack of a good idea, but for lack of customers. And too many engineers and startup founders focus too much of their energy just on the product without thinking early and frequently about whether they're going to be customers for that product. And so the Startup Owner's Manual provides a very detailed step-by-step process, starting from thinking through the business model and then getting out of the building to talk to customers to make sure that you're solving a problem that people will actually care about, and that the product you're developing or the service you're developing is a good fit to solve that problem.
Right. Well, it sounds like very logical stuff, but the way you've constructed it, and I've seen the book, the way the materials are put together really, I think, puts a much more granular focus on each of the steps that you really need to go through to make sure you're on the right track to finding a product that people are actually going to want to spend money on, or spend time with in the case of a broader service. Let's talk about one of the pages. I'm going to hold it up here, but then I'm going to insert it into the video. And this is a page from your presentation, and this is about that startups are not small versions of big companies. Talk about that idea for a little bit, because I think it's really instructive.
Yeah, well, I think that if you go back to 1908, when Harvard awarded the very first Masters of Business Administration, and it was a set of tools and processes that were used to run big companies. Big companies are all about execution.
Right.
Do this, then do this, hit this quarterly number, achieve these targets, that sort of thing. And for probably the first 50 years, or the last 50 years, or most of the last 50 years, everybody assumed that you use those same tools and same measurements for startups. But startups aren't about execution. Good startups are on a search. They're out trying to find that business model that makes sense, to find a marriage between a market and a product, or what's known as product market fit. And that search doesn't go in a straight line and can't be measured on precise quarter-to-quarter, metrics. P&L, what good is a P&L at a startup when in the first year or sometimes more, there's no revenue at all? It's
There's
in
no
the
P, yeah.
phase.
Right.
And so the tools for managing that search are very different from the tools for managing the quarter-by-quarter execution of a big company. And we address that in depth in the book. And we encourage startups to really think about that carefully, not just within the founding team, but with their investors and their board members, to make sure that they're asking the right questions about progress on the search and finding the right mix of business model elements to really develop a startup that's got growth and scalability behind it.
Right. Well, and that's a great lead into the next chart. that we're going to talk about, and this is around the idea of a pivot. And in the press, we see the term pivot, and people that talk to entrepreneurs hear about this idea of a pivot, and it's usually with a knowing glance that they're pivoting now, and that typically is shorthand for they've used an awful lot of their money and no one seems to want what they've got, and so they've got to do something else. And your view of the pivot, and I'll show it up here, but then I'll put it up, insert it into the video. Your view of the pivot is different. Why don't you talk about your view of what the pivot's about?
Well, I think in a startup, if the startup and its investors and board members are really committed to being on an honest search for a repeatable, scalable, profitable business model, then a startup should be pivoting all the time as it learns a better way to go to market, or should it be a lease instead of a purchase, or a freemium model focused on converting to revenue a little bit later. In the example you gave of a company just about running out of money, that pivot is driven by a crisis, or it foments a crisis where everybody's saying, oh my God, we're on the verge of failing, somebody's going to get fired, we're going to run out of money, or whatever. But in a startup that's honestly conducting a search, pivot is a good thing, not a bad thing. And the learning that says, gee, we're going down the wrong direction here, let's course correct quickly and with agility. Sort of those kinds of changes should be, if not celebrated, at least welcomed as improvements in the long-term opportunity. And they should happen without firings, without crisis, and with honest conversations about, gee, is there a better way to move this business forward?
Do you view this as a best practice that's being used frequently by companies that are already, have angel funding, or is this something that you wish more companies were able to do?
Well, I think, to be honest, it's much more of a valley phenomenon than it is on the East Coast so far, partly because Steve Blank has been sort of evangelizing the concept for 12 years, and by now thousands of MBAs and engineers coming out of Stanford and Berkeley have been exposed to Steve's work. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's more a matter of the enlightenment, if you will, of the investors than it is the stage of funding. There are later stage companies that are still sort of pivoting, trying to find the right sort of business mix. And it happens much more often, certainly in the earlier angel sort of funded arena, where the investors are betting on the kernel of an idea and not quite sure where it's going to go, but they're willing to give, they trust the team, they trust the strength of the core idea enough to give the team some running room to really navigate their way through customer feedback and to sort of morph or evolve the business idea through a bunch of pivots along the way until they're confident that the business is really showing a sort of opportunity for profitable scalability.
Right. That's I think that's really instructive. So, on the East Coast, we are building up into where we want to be from an entrepreneurship point of view, and New York is doing awfully well. But I haven't heard a lot of companies having the approach that you're describing, especially those that are funded. And if it makes sense, the Valley's been doing it for an awfully long time, and you do learn things through that process. So I think go ahead. You're going to say something.
I was going to say that, entrepreneurs assume that because somebody wrote them a check, that person had the money, therefore, by definition, they're theoretically a lot smarter than I am, so they must be endorsing my idea.
Right.
But those people are, making bunches of different bets, and they're just saying your idea has as good a chance as any of the other ideas I'm writing a check for. And I'm writing a dozen checks hoping that one of them is going to turn into Facebook or Google.
Right.
That's not a blanket endorsement of your idea. It is the opportunity to find the right idea and the right scalable business opportunity. And if the investor and the founder sort of hold hands and shake hands and agree that that's what this is about, it dramatically improves the chances for success when you don't have to come back to your investor with your tail between your legs and say, well, we're shifting the idea 30 degrees to the left or 20 to the right or whatever, that it's a partnership that embraces feedback and change that's driven by good customer feedback.
Right. Well, that's an excellent place to start. I think as to end. I mean, it was. I really think this whole idea of the pivot is super important. And the book is getting great reviews. I know it's selling out on a regular basis at Amazon, and people can find it at Amazon.com. They can also find it at knsranch.com. And Bob, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure, Peter. Thanks very much for having me. Have
All
a great
right.
day.
Take care.